Steve Harvey has asked tens of thousands of questions on Family Feud. Questions about food, about habits, about what people do when they think nobody is watching. Most of the time, the answers get a laugh and the game moves on. But on a Thursday afternoon in the fall of 2024, he asked a question that he had asked hundreds of times before. A simple question. A warm-up question. The kind designed to loosen a family up before the real game begins. And a woman named Carol Patterson heard it and completely fell apart. Not in a small way. In the way that only happens when something has been held together for a very long time and then, without warning, stops holding. Steve Harvey did not move to the next segment. He did not signal the producers. He did not reach for a joke to ease the tension. He simply looked at Carol Patterson and waited, the way you wait for someone you respect. What came out of that waiting was one of the most honest conversations ever broadcast on a game show stage. And by the time it was over, no one in that studio, not the audience, not the crew, not Steve Harvey himself, was the same person they had been when the taping began. This is the story of how one question broke a woman open and in doing so, gave her family something they hadn't known they were missing. Carol Patterson was 61 years old. She was originally from a small town in rural Mississippi and had moved to Birmingham, Alabama at the age of 19 with $40 a suitcase, and the specific kind of determination that grows in people who have been told too many times that they don't have what it takes. She had spent the next 4 decades proving those people wrong, quietly, without fanfare, and entirely on her own terms. Carol had worked as a certified nursing assistant for 38 years, the last 20, 2 of them at the same long-term care facility on the south side of Birmingham. She had bathed patients who couldn't speak. She had held the hands of people in their final hours. She had been there on the night shift when no one else was, on the holiday shifts when everyone else went home, and on the days when the work was so heavy that most people would not have come back the next morning. Carol always came back. She had raised 3 children, Terrence, 38, Angela, 35, and Deshawn, 31, mostly on her own after her husband, Ronnie, had died of a sudden heart attack when Deshawn was just 6 years old. Ronnie's death had left Carol with 3 children, a mortgage she had no idea how they would keep, and a grief so total that for a period of about 3 months, she described later, she was not entirely sure she was still a full person. But she had gotten up. Every single morning, she had gotten up. She had packed the lunches and driven to work and come home and helped with the homework and kept the lights on and shown her children what it looked like to keep going when keeping going felt impossible. She had never spoken much about those years. Not to her children, not to her colleagues, not to anyone. She was not a woman who narrated her own suffering. She simply moved through it. By the time her children were grown, Carol had achieved something that looked modest from the outside and was extraordinary from the inside: a paid off house, 3 college-educated children, and 38 years of a career she had given everything to. Terrence was an accountant in Atlanta. Angela was a teacher in Birmingham, 10 minutes from the house where she had grown up. Deshawn was finishing his residency in internal medicine. The doctor in the family, a fact that Carol mentioned with studied casualness and complete, undisguised pride. The Family Feud application had been Angela's project. She had filled it out on a Sunday afternoon while her children napped, submitted it mostly as something fun to try, and had genuinely forgotten about it by the following week. When the call came 8 months later, she had to ask the producer to repeat the show's name because she couldn't immediately place why someone from that production company would be calling her. Carol's reaction, when Angela told her, was characteristic: a single raised eyebrow, a pause, and then, "Well, I suppose I can wear the blue dress." She had been pressing that blue dress for 40 years. She had worn it to graduations, to church anniversaries, to every significant occasion that required her to show up looking like the person she intended to be. It was, to her children, as much a part of their mother as her voice. She wore it to the taping. The Patterson family walked onto the Family Feud stage on a Thursday afternoon looking like exactly what they were: a family that had been through difficulty together and come out the other side closer for it. Carol was at the center, poised, composed, the blue dress immaculate. with Terrence and Angela flanking her and Deshawn and Angela's husband, Marcus, filling out the team. Steve Harvey worked the line the way he always does, finding the rhythm of each family. He got Terrence talking about his commute from Atlanta. He got Marcus to admit that Angela still corrected his grammar at the dinner table. He got Deshawn to explain what a residency actually involved, and reacted to the answer with the expression of a man hearing about voluntarily choosing to not sleep for 3 years. Then he came to Carol. He looked at her for a moment. The blue dress, the composed posture, the expression of a woman who had been in enough rooms to not be particularly intimidated by this one. "You raised all 3 of these people," he said. "I did," Carol said. "By yourself?" "Mostly," she said, "with some help from God and a very patient school principal." The audience laughed. Steve smiled. "How old were you when you lost your husband?" 29, Carol said. Same even tone, same composed posture. Steve nodded slowly. Then he asked the question. The simple question. The one he had asked 100 times before. Who was your biggest support? When things got hard? Who did you lean on? Carol opened her mouth, and then something happened that clearly surprised her as much as it surprised everyone else in the room. Her face changed. Not dramatically. There was no sharp intake of breath, no sudden collapse. It was subtler and, because of that, more devastating. It was the face of a person who has just been asked a question they do not have an answer to, and who has only at that moment realized they do not have one. She closed her mouth. She looked down briefly. When she looked back up, her eyes were full. She started. Stopped. Her chin lifted slightly, the reflex of a woman who had spent 40 years not letting things show. But the tears came anyway. Quiet, unhurried tears, entirely unlike the theatrical crying of someone performing emotion. These were the tears of someone who had been caught off guard by an honest answer. Steve Harvey had already stopped moving. The audience had gone completely still. "Take your time," Steve said. Just that. No joke, no redirect, no production cue. Just those 3 words in the voice he uses when he is not hosting a show. Carol pressed her lips together. She took one breath. Then she said, "I don't know that I had one. I don't know that I ever. She stopped again. Then, more quietly, "I just kept going. There wasn't really anyone to lean on. There was just the next thing, the next morning, the next bill, the next thing." Terrence, standing to her left, had gone very still. Angela had her hand over her heart. Deshawn was looking at his mother with an expression that was equal parts love and something that looked like grief. The particular grief of understanding, for the first time, what your childhood actually cost someone. Carol looked at her children and saw their faces. She shook her head gently, the way mothers do when they want to head something off. "No," she said firmly, but not unkindly. "Don't do that. Don't you feel bad? You were children. It was my job, Mama," Angela said. Just the one word. In the voice of a daughter who is 35 years old and still, in this moment, entirely a child. Carol reached over and squeezed Angela's hand once firmly, the way she had probably squeezed it 1,000 times across 35 years of hard moments. Then she looked back at Steve and said, with a watery but genuine smile, "I'm sorry. I don't know where that came from." "I do," Steve said quietly. "That's 30 years of something that never got said out loud. That's where it came from." Carol looked at him. She nodded once, and in that nod was the acknowledgement of a woman who has lived her entire life being strong for other people, suddenly being seen. Simply, straightforwardly, without fuss. By a stranger on a television stage. She wiped her face carefully, with the precise movements of someone who has cried in front of people before, and learned how to do it without losing her dignity. She straightened her posture. She smoothed the front of the blue dress. "All right," she said. "I'm all right. Let's play the game." The audience applauded, not the loud, reflexive applause of a crowd responding to a cue, but the slower, more deliberate applause of people who have just witnessed something they want to honor. Steve Harvey let it run. He stood there and let the audience give Carol Patterson what the last 30 years had mostly not given her, a room full of people on their feet, applauding the simple, extraordinary fact of her. What happened before the game formally began was unplanned, unrehearsed, and entirely initiated by Terrence Patterson, the eldest child, the accountant from Atlanta, The son who had been watching his mother wipe her eyes on a game show stage and had apparently decided that 38 years was long enough to wait. He stepped forward slightly and said, "Can I? Steve, can I say something?" The Steve turned to him immediately. "Go ahead." Terrence looked at his mother. He was a composed man. Carol's composure lived in him visibly, but his voice, when he spoke, was not entirely steady. "Mama, I have wanted to say this for a long time. I don't know why I haven't. Maybe because we're your kids and we learned from you to just keep going and not make it about feelings. But I need to say it now." Carol was watching him with the careful, slightly wary attention of a mother who has learned that when her children start sentences this way, something important is coming. "I was 13 when Dad died," Terrence said. "I remember the night. I remember the hospital. I remember you telling us, and I remember watching you the next morning, the very next morning, making breakfast. And I remember thinking, even at 13, how is she doing that? How is she standing up right now?" He paused. "I never asked you. I never asked you how you did it. I never asked if you were okay. Not once in 25 years, because you never seemed like you needed me to ask. And I think I used that as an excuse. I think I let you carry it because you made it look like you could." Carol's chin was lifting again. The reflex. The lifelong reflex. "We all did." Angela said from her spot in the line. "We all let you carry it. Because you're our mom and it seemed like—" She stopped, chose the words carefully. "Like you were built for it, like you didn't need what the rest of us need." You're not, though," Deshawn said. He was the youngest, the doctor, the one who had been 6 years old when Ronnie died and had the least memory of before. His voice was quiet and precise in the way of someone who has learned to deliver difficult truths gently. "You're not built different. You just never stopped. And we never stopped you to say, you don't have to anymore. We've got you now. We have had you for a long time if you'd let us." Carol pressed her lips together hard. The chin was up, the posture was straight, but the tears were coming and there was nothing to be done about that. "I don't need—" she started. "Mama," Terrence said, gently and firmly, in the voice of a son who learned it from his mother. "Let us." The silence in the studio was total. The kind of silence that an audience holds not because they have been asked to, but because they understand that something real is happening and they do not want to interrupt it. Steve Harvey had moved back another step. He was not hosting right now. He was just a person in a room where something important was being said, giving it the space it needed. Carol looked at her 3 children, the accountant, the teacher, the doctor, the 3 lives she had built out of grief and early mornings and a paid-off house in Birmingham, and something in her face that had been held tightly for a very long time loosened. Not collapsed. Loosened. The way a fist opens, slowly, when it finally decides it doesn't need to be a fist anymore. She opened her arms, and the 3 of them, Terrence, Angela, Deshawn, moved toward her at the same time, without coordination, without discussion. Just the instinct of children who know exactly where they belong. The audience did not applaud this time. They were crying too quietly to applaud. Steve Harvey turned away for a moment, just briefly, just long enough to compose himself. When he turned back, his voice was steady but his eyes were not. "Carol Patterson," he said, "I have hosted this show for a long time. I have asked that question, who do you lean on, more times than I can count. And I have never once gotten an answer that stopped me the way yours did, because your answer told the truth that nobody ever says out loud. Sometimes the strongest people in the room are the ones nobody thinks to check on, and that is not right. It has never been right." He looked at the audience. "Whoever that person is in your life, whoever the Carol is in your family, check on them. Today, not tomorrow. Today." The applause that followed was the loudest of the taping. They played the game. Carol Patterson, it turned out, was extremely good at Family Feud. 38 years of paying close attention to other human beings had given her an almost uncanny ability to predict what a survey of 100 people would say. She got the top answer on 4 out of 5 fast money questions. The family won $18,000. Deshawn lifted his mother off the ground when the final number appeared on the board, and Carol, for the first time in the entire taping, laughed loudly and without reservation. It was a remarkable sound. Her children clearly thought so too. All three of them were grinning the specific grin of people who have just been given something they didn't realize they had been missing. The episode aired 6 weeks after the taping. The clip of Carol's breakdown, and what her children said afterward, was shared over 8 million times in the first 48 hours. But the response that followed was unlike almost anything the Family Feud production team had seen before. The messages were not primarily about Carol. They were about the people in the viewers' own lives. They were about mothers, about the women and men who had spent decades being the strong one and had never once been asked if they were okay. About the caregivers and the providers and the people who showed up, without exception, without complaint, and were so reliably present that the people around them had simply stopped noticing the cost. A woman in Detroit wrote that she had watched the clip with her 70-year-old mother sitting next to her, and that it had started a conversation they had never had before, one that lasted 4 hours and covered 30 years of things her mother had carried without saying. She wrote, "I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know what she had been through. She never told me because she didn't want me to worry. I am 51 years old and I am just now learning who my mother is." A man in Seattle wrote that his father, a man he described as the most self-sufficient person he had ever known, had watched the clip 3 times in a row and then called him. His father had not initiated a phone call in 11 years. They talked for 2 hours. At the end of the call, his father said, "I might need some help with a few things." The man wrote, "He has never said those words in his life. I drove down the next weekend and we spent 2 days together just being together. I don't know how to explain what that meant." The messages came from every state, from several countries, from people of every background and age. The common thread was simple: someone in their life had been carrying something alone, and they had not known, or had not stopped long enough to ask, or had allowed themselves to be reassured by strength that was actually just a very old and practiced habit of not showing weakness. Steve Harvey addressed the clip on his talk show the following week. He spoke about it with the particular deliberateness of a man who has been thinking carefully about what he wants to say. "I've asked that question 1,000 times," he said. "Who do you lean on?" And the honest answer, the answer Carol gave, is one that I think a lot of people in this country would give if they felt safe enough to say it out loud. "Nobody. I leaned on nobody. I just kept going." He paused. And we celebrate that. We call it strength. We put it on motivational posters. But Carol's face, when she realized she didn't have an answer, that face was telling us something different. It was telling us that keeping going alone is not the same thing as being okay. And we have been confusing those two things for too long. The clip of Steve saying those words was shared nearly as widely as the original Family Feud segment. For Carol herself, the aftermath was both overwhelming and, in a way she had not expected, deeply clarifying. She had spent her entire adult life in a role, the strong one, the reliable one, the one who handled it, and that role, she was beginning to understand, had become something of a wall between herself and the people who loved her most. Not intentionally. Not because anyone had been unkind, but because she had built it so thoroughly and for so long that everyone on both sides of it had simply accepted its existence. The conversation that her children had started on that stage did not end when the taping did. It continued over the following weeks in phone calls and visits, and text message threads that were longer and more honest than any that had come before. Terrence drove down from Atlanta on a Saturday in November for no reason other than to sit with his mother for the weekend. He fixed the gutter that had been loose for 2 years. He watched football with her. He did not once mention the show or the clip or the millions of views. He was just there. Angela, who lived 10 minutes away and had always been the child Carol saw most frequently, began coming over on Tuesday evenings. Not for any stated reason. She would bring food or not. They would talk or not. She would sometimes bring her own children, Carol's grandchildren, and Carol would sit on the floor with them and do the things that grandmothers do when nobody is watching, which is to say everything. Deshaun, finishing his residency in a city 4 hours away, called every Sunday, not a check-in call, A real call, the kind that takes an hour, the kind where you find out who someone actually is. He asked his mother questions he had never thought to ask before about her childhood in Mississippi, about meeting Ronnie, about the years right after the death when he had been too young to remember and she had been too private to describe. Carol answered. Slowly at first, carefully, with the instinct of a woman unaccustomed to being the subject. But she answered. It was Deshawn who noticed, during one of these Sunday calls, that his mother sounded different than she had 6 months earlier. Not happier exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for what he was hearing. Fuller, perhaps. More present. Less managed. You sound better, Mama, he said. Carol was quiet for a moment. I think I am, she said. I think I just needed someone to ask. The 18,000 prize was used true to form practically. Carol paid off the last portion of a medical bill she had been quietly managing for 2 years. A procedure she had not told her children about because she had not wanted them to worry. When Terence found out, he called Angela. Angela called Deshawn. There was a brief, heated family conversation about full disclosure that Carol listened to with the patience of a woman who had refereed far more serious arguments. At the end of it she said, I will try to do better, but I am 61 years old and you are going to need to be patient with me. It was, her children agreed later, the most hopeful thing she had ever said. 6 months after the episode aired, the long-term care facility where Carol had worked for 22 years held a small ceremony to dedicate a corner of their common room as the Carol Patterson Reading Nook, a quiet space with comfortable chairs and a bookshelf, built on a modest donation from former colleagues and a grant that Angela had researched and written specifically for this purpose. The residents who could speak said they loved it. The ones who couldn't spoke with their faces. Carol sat in one of the chairs on the day of the dedication and looked around the room, at the residents she had bathed and held, and stayed with through the night, at the colleagues who had worked beside her for decades, at her 3 children standing along the back wall, and was, for a long moment, completely undone. Then she got up, straightened the front of the blue dress, and went to sit with the residents, because that was who she was and would always be, and she had finally, allowed herself to understand that this was not a diminishment. It was the whole thing. It was everything. A year after the taping, a journalist writing a piece on viral moments in game show history reached out to Carol for a comment. Carol, who did not do interviews as a general rule, agreed to answer 2 questions by email. The journalist asked her what she would say to people who saw themselves in her story, the people who had spent years being the strong one with no one to lean on. Carol's response was 3 sentences long. It was reprinted in full in the article and shared extensively on its own. Let someone help you. Not because you are weak, but because you have earned it. Strength was always meant to be shared, not stored. The journalist's second question was what she was most proud of. Carol wrote, My children. Not because of what they've achieved, though I am proud of that too, but because of who they were in that studio, because they saw me. After all this time they saw me. And I let them. Carol Patterson did not go to Family Feud looking for healing. She went because her daughter had entered a contest and her blue dress needed an occasion. She went because her son Deshawn needed to see his mother in the city before his residency consumed the rest of the year. She went, if she is honest, because 41 years of getting up every morning and handling it had not left much room for things that were simply fun, and this seemed like it might be fun. What she did not expect was to be asked a question she couldn't answer. What she did not expect was to find, in her own silence, the shape of something she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight. There are Carol Pattersons in every family. People who absorb the difficulty without complaint, who show up without being asked, who make strength look so effortless that the people around them mistake the performance of fine for actually being fine. They are not asking for pity. They are not asking for recognition. Most of the time, they are not asking for anything at all, because asking is not something they were ever taught to do. Ask them anyway. Ask the Carol in your family who they lean on. Ask them what was hard. Ask them what they needed and didn't get. Ask them how they kept going. And then, This is the important part. Stay long enough to hear the answer.